Dean, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is the second time I've visited Dukagjini College. I just looked at the title that I invented for my talk, and I've suddenly realised it's a very big and long subject. So I thought I would concentrate on two particular episodes which are probably not so well known to you of when Kosovo played a particular part in European history, and then we can talk afterwards about other aspects of the period since 1875, particularly the experience that Kosovo had as part of Yugoslavia between 1918 and 1999. That was also very much part of European history. But I thought I would just concentrate on two big diplomatic crises in the run-up to the First World War, where, in fact, Kosovo didn't play a leading part, but did play its part, and where those European crises, I think, did have a profound effect on life in Kosovo. And I particularly wanted to do this because as I go around Kosovo and meet people, a lot of people say that they are sceptical, they are doubtful about whether Kosovo really has a European perspective. I don't agree with that. I think that at some point Kosovo will be a member of the European Union. But I can understand that. I can understand those doubts because we have a Europe at the moment where famously Serbia and Russia, but also 5 members of the European Union, don't recognise Kosovo. But I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think that some of this doubt I come across in Kosovo among ordinary people about, if you like, the Europeanness of Kosovo comes from a rather more deep-seated sense, a deeper sense that perhaps Kosovo has never been part of the mainstream of European politics and history. And again, I really don't agree with that. And as a historian who happens to have done a certain amount of work on the diplomatic history of the Balkans in the 19th century, that's why I wanted to talk to you about these two crises. And the two crises were the so-called Eastern Crisis that started in 1875, and the other one is the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, which immediately came before the First World War. It's worth saying, however, a little bit about Kosovo as it was in 1875 when one of the big European crises broke out. Kosovo at that time was, of course, part of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire. I think it's very important to understand that although the Ottoman Empire covered large parts of Anatolia, large parts of the Middle East, it was seen at that time very much as a European power. Yes, the Ottoman Empire in Europe was in decline, but it was, in fact, it was always referred to at that time in the British newspapers as the sick man of Europe. Now maybe that wasn't very flattering, but it does show that it was thought of as a European power. And I think one of the problems that all the countries of this region face in kind of enunciating, in enforcing their European identity, is there's this sense that this period of Ottoman history, you were cut off from Europe. My point is that the Ottoman Empire was very much a European power. Now, it was the sick man of Europe in 1875. 1875, and by 1875 the Turks had already lost control of a number of their European possessions. Not to go into too much detail, but just to say that, first of all, although they claimed the Principality of Montenegro, the reality was that they had never controlled Montenegro. But equally, at this point, even in 1875, Montenegro was not formally recognised as an independent state by the great powers, a bit like Kosovo and Russia today. That the great powers, and when I say the great powers, in Europe in 1875, that basically meant Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, and dare I say, just about Italy. Some people were a bit doubtful about whether Italy was really a great power, but it was a newly united country at that time, and it did, as we'll see, play an important role. So there was Montenegro. Then you also had Serbia, but a very, very small Serbia compared with now. Basically, Belgrade and its immediate southern hinterland. The Karađorđević, Karađorđe himself, had effectively established himself as an independent ruler in 1804, although still in 1875, Prince Milan of the Abramovich dynasty was technically a subject of the Sultan, but in practice this little Serbian state was independent. Greece in the 1820s, with a lot of support from all sorts of romantic people in Britain, like Lord Byron, had established its independence in the 1820s and was an independent kingdom. But a very small Greece, much, much smaller than now. Basically, Athens, the Peloponnese, and a little bit of territory around it. And then a fourth one, Romania. After the Crimean War, Romania had, rather like Serbia, become a principality under, in fact, a German prince, who was technically the subject of the Ottoman Sultan, but was in fact independent. So the Ottoman Empire was on its way down in Europe, but still in 1875 you had all of Bulgaria, all of Macedonia, which meant a lot more than it does now, Kosovo, and the whole of Albania, all part of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. And Kosovo actually had quite a distinct identity within the Ottoman Empire at that time. There was a governorate, a vilayet, as it was called. The vilayet, in 1875 it was called the vilayet of Pristina, headquarters Pristina. It covered all of modern Kosovo. It covered, where are they? Gusinje and Plava, which are just over the mountains over there in Montenegro. It covered most of modern Macedonia, Skopje particularly, and it covered Niš in Serbia. But it was all, Vali, the governor, was based in Pristina, and in fact, in 1877, the name was changed to the Vilayet of Kosovo. Also, at that time, there was a Turkish language newspaper produced in Pristina. I mean, it was an official journal produced by the Turkish authorities. It was in Turkish, but it was called Kosovo. So there was a Kosovo identity already. Now, the Eastern Crisis of 1875 started in Herzegovina, where, around places like Trebinje, the mainly Serb Orthodox Christian peasants rose up against their Ottoman Muslim overlords, largely over taxation. The revolt became very serious and quickly spread to Bosnia. Two of the European great powers were particularly concerned about this for opposite reasons. Austria-Hungary, because Austria-Hungary was always worried about risings in the Ottoman Empire by its Slav subjects. Why? Because Austria-Hungary, rather like the Ottoman Empire, was a multinational empire, including quite a lot of Slavs, Croats, Slovenes, Czechs, Slovaks, and the Austrians were always worried that uprisings by Slavs in the Turkish Empire would lead to problems with their own Slav population. population. So they were worried about the rising in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The other country from the great powers that was interested was Russia, because Russia saw itself as the Slav Orthodox protector of the Slav Orthodox peoples of the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire. However, when this all started, Russia and Austria-Hungary tried to work together. They worked together with the Iron Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, and sent what was called the Berlin Memorandum, demanding that the Ottoman authorities reform the landholding and taxation arrangements in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Turkish government took no notice. And then the small states, which I mentioned earlier, Montenegro and Serbia, went to war with the Turkish Empire in support of these rebels in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The great powers became increasingly concerned at the instability of the Turkish Empire. Britain, I would say at this point, under a conservative government, was quite supportive of the Ottoman Empire, because Britain did not want to see Russia expanding its influence into the Balkans. However, as the war between Serbia and Montenegro on one hand and Turkey on the other progressed, there was a rising in Bulgaria, also Slav, also part of the Ottoman Empire. And this was put down with enormous force by the Turkish authorities. There was a famous massacre in the Batak when the Turkish irregular Bashi-Bazouk forces killed over 10,000 people. And this led to a huge media outcry in the West, particularly in Britain, where there were lots of headlines about the Bulgarian atrocities. And this forced all the great powers to try and bring the crisis to an end as quickly as possible. A meeting took place in Constantinople, Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, where all the great powers tried to persuade the, in fact, very new Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, tried to persuade Abdul Hamid II to grant autonomy, not independence, but to grant autonomy to Bosnia-Herzegovina and to Bulgaria. And the reaction of Abdul Hamid II, who was an extremely crafty, clever ruler, was, for the first time ever, to summon a Turkish parliament. He said, "We've gone democratic. We don't need to make reforms because now we are going to summon a parliament like you have in the West." And indeed, an Ottoman parliament, very briefly, did meet with representatives from all over the Ottoman Empire, from Europe, from North Africa, and from the Middle East. And there were some rather interesting people in that parliament. One of whom was called Abdul Fresheri. Abdul Fresheri was, in fact, the MP in this parliament for Yanina, which is now in northern Greece, but which was then very much an Ottoman Albanian city on the coast. I'll come back to Abdul Fresheri in a minute. Anyway, the reality is that this rather token Ottoman parliament, which didn't last very long, was used by Abdul Hamid II to back up his refusal to take action over Bosnia-Herzegovina and Bulgaria. Russia went to war against Turkey with the support of Serbia and Montenegro and of the Bulgarian rebels, and fairly rapidly defeated the Turkish Empire. And I wish I had a map, but I don't. The Russians then forced upon the Turks a treaty called the Treaty of San Stefano. And the Treaty of San Stefano was quite extraordinary, really, because it created in a very large part of the Balkans, or it would have created in the large part of the Balkans,